Happy 2023 all, and thank you for joining us today for our discussion of ADA, Reasonable Accommodations in the Workplace. I'm Meghan Trout, Business Operations Manager for Employers Advantage, and with me are HR Business Partner Team Lead Penny Yountz, Senior HR Business Partner Shannon Curtis, and our newest team member, HR Business Partner Denise Mulhollen. Thanks for participating today, team. I've got my floaties on and I'm ready to dive in. I'll start by asking, what's a reasonable accommodation?
I'll start if you don't mind.
Okay, sure, Denise.
Let's back up that question to where does a reasonable accommodation stem from? It actually stems from a federal law that was enacted back in 1990 called the Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it it doesn't guarantee, but it is a federal civil rights law, and it was designed to protect people with disabilities against discrimination. So that being said, a reasonable accommodation comes from that, and you can provide one of those if possible, if it doesn't present an undue hardship, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But a reasonable accommodation is an adjustment or modification to a job, a workplace environment, or even to an applicant's process for when they, before they begin a job. It gives this individual the opportunity with a disability to be on the same playing field as those without a disability. So that's pretty much what it is.
I think the interesting thing about the definition that were provided as far as guidance to follow, and again, this will connect to what we deem unreasonable in a moment, but Denise, reasonable accommodation or modification of or adjustment to job, that's so vague. It's so difficult to work with. It's one law where it's so much is in your hands to determine as an employer, which is scary because this is a really serious, situation.
Absolutely.
But it is one of those things with small businesses that while it sounds like it's very laborious, whatever the word is, and because it's my Southern slang, I'm sure I'm butchering it, but it does sound like a lot. But here's the thing. It's one of those things where you don't want to let it intimidate you, because I have seen a lot of employers kind of either do two things, like head in the sand like an ostrich. If I don't acknowledge it, it doesn't exist and I don't have to worry about it. Or they completely tuck and run. And so when you talk about undue hardship, just keep in mind, just because someone needs a disability or needs an accommodation, it doesn't have to be the most expensive thing. And so I think a lot of times as small employers, we hear accommodation and then we go, oh gosh, this is going to cost me a ton of money, or I'm going to have to completely revamp my workplace, or I'm going to have to redo the parking lot or redo the bathrooms, and a variety of other things. And so it's just one of those things to don't let it scare you, because there are a lot of opportunities out there. There's a lot of resources. One of the things that most employers don't know about that does exist is the job accommodation network. And this is like a little nonprofit group where they are out there. They have 1-800 number, they have a website, and they have a lot of resources available to give you low-cost solutions so that you can do the right thing and provide those accommodations. So those are things to keep in mind. It does sound like a lot, but it doesn't have to be.
And Penny, to piggyback off that, what's deemed reasonable looks different for a small company, mid-size, large company, which is why the legislation has to be somewhat vague. So that's a good point, Penny, to utilize external resources, because it looks different depending on your company, your industry, your company size, your budget, all of that. But it is important. It's needed. This is a good thing to have in place.
It really is. And it's one of those things too, like as we continue through this economy where it is so competitive to get good employees, in some cases, this is a completely untapped market. And a lot of times whenever you have someone that, maybe they do have a disability, if you're willing to work with them, this is going to sound like I'm making an categorical assumption, but most employers that work with individuals who need an accommodation are on the receiving end of extreme loyalty by that individual. And so because they value the fact that you're willing to make that accommodation, they take that into consideration, and they do reward that with their loyalty and doing their best for you. So So that is an untapped market in a lot of areas. I know my sister, for example, is hearing impaired. And so it took us a while to find her a place of employment, someone that was willing to work with her. She didn't have to have sign language. All she needed was a notebook and a pen. And as long as they kept her with a notebook and a pen, then she could write whatever she needed. She could hand the pen to the other person. They could write back whatever their response was. And so once we were able to find her a job and get an employer that was willing to work with her and a supervisor that was willing to work with her, she stayed there, what, 20 years? And so you get that longevity a lot of times. I'm not going to say that for every scenario, but a lot of times if you're willing to work with them and they receive it and feel welcome and feel like they're part of the team, then you're going to get that loyalty that you're looking for in employees.
Right. And I believe it also shows the character of the employer willing to do that, which they should be doing anyway, but it does show the character. Also, piggybacking off of what Shannon said about how vague this is, it has to be applied and considered on a case-by-case basis. Because just like you said, Shannon, it is so broad. I mean, you can just picture how large a disability is. And going back to my original thought, there back in 2008, there was an additional law, the ADAAA, which expanded the list of disabilities. So, you know, like I said, take that into consideration, and that really opens up quite a broad spectrum to really take a look at and try to get, you know, down to whether or not you can make this accommodation or whether it's going to be an undue hardship.
Are all employers required to provide reasonable accommodations? Does it matter your size? All? Okay.
Generally,
Yes.
yes, generally, yes.
Yeah. All right.
It's normally for 15 or more employees, they're required to provide a reasonable accommodation if possible. However, you have to look at state and local laws, because if they are, some of them may specifically state that it would be less than 15. So you always have to, you know, not only the federal, but you got to look at state and local. From my perspective, I mean, Shannon, Penny, you can, you know, chime in. A lot of times, or it seems like most of the time, the whatever is in the best interest of the employer is usually what they go by. Not all the time, but usually.
Yeah, I think too, you have to think about running the risk of moving into some territory that's deemed discriminatory as well. So there's still there's a moral component as well, but there's a legal component outside of the ADA where you have to think through a couple other laws that might touch on this in a roundabout way that you are required to do, even if you are a smaller than 15 employee organization. So just do it if you can.
Yeah, just do it.
Consider it at least if you can.
If you can.
Exactly.
Do you guys have some examples of accommodations that are generally considered reasonable?
I had a few, and these are all I've experienced or I know someone who's experienced. Some are easy, like seating assignments. They need to be closer to somewhere, or they need to be on the bottom floor versus just upstairs if there's stairs and they can't navigate the stairs as well. I think the most common I get is change in schedule. You know, I can only work a 7-hour workday. My doctor says I only, you know, I have this medical condition, or I have to be off camera, or my lighting needs to be changed in my work area because of migraines or something along those lines, a medical condition. I've also come across one, well, Penny, I've had hearing issues, especially when it's on a phone, a job that requires phone. But I had one recently where someone needed additional accommodations because of dyslexia. So the accommodation simply was adding another layer of editing into documents, you know, adding something. It's just such a simple, free thing to do to accommodate this individual. So some of them are, like Penny had said earlier on in the call, just, you know,
not expensive.
Easy peasy.
Easy peasy.
Yeah, I would say probably, and primarily I think because a lot of my client base is manufacturing. And so I think, you know, a lot of the things that I've seen is maybe providing assistance if they need to have a lifting component, maybe some job sharing responsibilities on certain things, maybe a temporary assignment in a different department for a short-term period. I'm trying to think. One employee needed like a special shoe, and we had a steel toe shoe requirements. So we just had to buy them a special shoe within the steel toe. It may have been like $20-$30 more, but it was, a reasonable cost considering the individuals on their feet all the time. It may be providing a sit-stand stool so that they can rest as needed while they're still in their work area. Anti-fatigue mats I've seen. And so all of them are just, again, smaller opportunities to get things done and still do the right thing by the employees.
Denise, I want to hear some of yours in a sec, but I just thought that was so interesting, Penny, because mine are all workplace and yours are all manufacturing.
Yeah.
And they're completely different. Mine's about lighting and yours about, fatigue pads and whatnot. Anyway, Denise, what are some of yours?
Wonderful. Well, I'm thinking one of the big ones that'll apply to probably all of us, if possible, with the employer is telework. Some people, like, for example, if someone had, I'm thinking like a gastrointestinal problem, of course you could move their cubicle or desk or what have you closer to the restroom, for example.
Mhm.
But if it's, if it's a very chronic condition, there's a possibility they could be, a good candidate for telework. So that's something that needs to be taken into consideration too. Also, in this one, Penny, you were saying about you had a relative, arthritis. I also have a relative that has arthritis. Writing recognition software, being able to take breaks. It depends on, where it's at, but, sometimes, like in the case of my relative, it's throughout the whole body. So, you have to really sit down and think through, start that interactive process with that employee and, figure out what they need and even get examples from them. Sometimes they're the best answer that you got, not necessarily that you have to use it if it's not, if it presents some kind of an undue hardship, but usually the employee is the one that provides the best answer for you.
Yeah. Denise,
And
that
Denise-
is so key. Oh, Penny, I was just going to say that interactive. I don't know if you're going to say it's scary. It's scary because someone might they've just disclosed something that's confidential and sensitive possibly, and so it's scary. But the key component is to feel comfortable discussing what they need from you, as opposed to assuming it has to be an interactive process, or it won't be successful.
Yeah.
And I was just going to say these comments are a great springboard into another topic from an HR standpoint, in that now is a good time to make sure you have your job descriptions in order. Because this is one of the things when we're doing job descriptions, we recommend to put what are the needs, physical components, hands, eyes, taste, what are all of the different things that might be required in this position? Because if you get into a due diligence process with the ADA, the very first thing you want to take a look at is, what does the job description say is required? And if it's a significant disability, then you're probably going to be interacting with that employee's doctor. And so that's one of the very first things that you're going to send with the employee to the doctor, to say, here's the job description. Tell us what they can and can't do. And then when you get that documentation back from the employee and the doctor, then you just move forward with saying, okay, can we do this? Can we do this? Can we do this? And how can we work to get this to where it is a win-win scenario for everybody? But that job description is one key component in this. Because that is what is used to start the discussion. Because if you don't have a job description, and I won't say this is true of every employee, but if you do not have a job description, you have no clue what that employee is going in and telling the doctor that you could be making them do. And I've had that happen in workers' compensation claims too. And so if you are able to send in that information from your standpoint, then you have a little bit more control over what's being given to the doctor. To make sure that they have a true representation. Not saying that everyone will misrepresent what they're doing, but let's face it, there are some people out there that might try. So it's best.
I also think that's necessary when you're determining undue hardships.
Right.
Like, this is the requirement of the job. This is what was advertised. This is what you agreed to when you were hired. So now let's talk about why we might deem that an undue hardship relative to what your job description states is required.
Yeah.
Right. And the newest job descriptions, if they are, the new version, if you will, show essential functions versus the marginal functions. And one thing to keep in mind, you don't have to change one of the essential functions. However, that's why everybody needs to put on their thinking caps. There's always a possibility you can make a modification to it. So that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah. And if you need help with your job descriptions, contact your HR business partner or employer's advantage.
Exactly.
What would be considered an undue hardship? Speaking of undue hardships, are there things that are considered too hard to do?
I've had some where it was unpredictable, the request. So the condition was one that was unpredictable. Okay. And it was very difficult when there were tight schedules that had to be maintained and shift work that had to be maintained. The unpredictability was going to be very difficult to navigate. Okay. We maintained an interactive process. We actually dug in a little bit more to the doctor and to try to create a scenario where maybe we blocked off times a day. Or Penny job share is a great way in which to tackle that. But that one was borderline difficult the unpredictability was difficult, a difficult ask.
I would say, and probably two other things that are pretty kind of cut and dry is if there's a safety issue, right? So if the individual is diagnosed with narcolepsy, or something like that where they have no control over it and it just happens, then obviously we don't want them on a forklift or in a moving vehicle, right? Because then that puts us at risk. And so that might be an individual who would be a candidate for a different position in the organization if it existed. And then, of course, if it is something that does require building restructuring or, installing some sort of equipment for someone, then there's the financial aspect of that, because there may be some larger accommodations that a small company just can't afford. And if it's going to, put the business at the potential risk of going under because it's such a large amount of money to absorb in order to do this, then obviously they're not going to make the employers do that, because you can't put yourself out of business. The other thing that employers sometimes think that they have to do, but they don't, is you also don't have to increase the work of another employee just so this individual can have an accommodation either. Like you can't make the work of someone 3 times harder because you're trying to alleviate task from someone else. So that's also not.
Or hire someone. Or hire a new person to help them.
Yes,
exactly. I thought of a possible undue hardship here. I must be hungry because I'm thinking about the Italian restaurant where I like to go to. It's dimly lit. It's kind of like a little romantic, restaurant, and an employee that would have like a vision impairment. What if they were to say, I need the lights turned on, I can't see? That would change the ambiance, and it would absolutely change the whole, way that this restaurant has operated. So that could possibly be some sort of undue hardship. Of course, now that I just said that, maybe you could have one of those, when they take the order, maybe you could have something like I have like a Kindle or something that has it's backlit. There's always things you can think of, but in the grand scheme of things, I think something like that would really have to be looked at. You can't change the business atmosphere to accommodate someone. So
as you were talking through that, Denise, I automatically went to I know this is going to sound bad, but they come out with those little crock headlights, and I'm envisioning you could just flip one of those onto a notebook so that the person can have the light right there on their quarter book.
Penny, I was going to say too, I think part of an accommodation, it can be, but there's the perception that it's unfair treatment. So you have to navigate that as well when you're accommodating someone, especially as it's legally required and morally necessary. You have to make sure you're managing any misperception that it's treating others unfairly. It's a balancing act.
Yeah,
it really is.
Yeah, definitely. Well, any last words?
The only last words that I can really think of is just through this process, just make sure as an employer, or ideally you would bring in your HR business partner or your HR representative to help facilitate this. But keep in mind that you want to make sure that the person feels comfortable through the process, and try not to do anything that makes them feel like less of a person for having gone through this, or having potentially, quote unquote, caused this matter. So you don't want to do anything that's going to make them feel bad. So do everything that you can to make them feel like a whole person, because that's what we're here for, is to figure out solutions so that we can enable them to be a productive employee within your organization. So we just want to make sure that we treat them with respect that they deserve through this process.
Yes, absolutely. And also, because this law is mandatory, just like Penny said earlier, it's great to have job descriptions. It also would be great to have a policy and a procedure. And when you talk about making sure that the employee is not, standing out from all the other employees, possibly make sure all of your managers are trained. Not all of them would know what to do. So, have some kind of a procedure where they can go, where they can get help, so they can get guidance on how to handle something like this.
Ditto.
Yeah.
And the one thing we didn't discuss that we might have to do later in the year is regarding as being disabled. So that's a whole nother topic that we didn't touch on today. So everything that we discussed today was for legitimate disability. So,
yeah.
If we ever get to a point where we're ready to chat about being regarded as, that's a whole nother subject.
We should
stay tuned.
Maybe it's a good subject. Great idea. Yeah. Make sure you follow us on social media so that way you can see when that happens. Thanks everyone again for tuning in. We hope everyone is having a great 2023, and we'll see you again next month.
Bye.
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 Bye.